Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. A little while ago, I sat down with Lynne Hardy, who is an associate editor for Call of Cthulhu and the line editor for the Rivers of London role-playing game. We talked about romance in gaming, and we talked about it in the context of Regency Cthulhu, which released a little while ago. But unfortunately, this video then disappeared onto a failed hard drive and has only just been recovered. So I now present the video to you. Please enjoy. Lynne talks about how romance can enhance your games, how to run it effectively, and how to make sure that all your players are comfortable with it. I'll jump across to the video in just a moment, but first, please remember to subscribe and enjoy.
As we've discussed before in other recordings that we've made, a lot of people hear the name Jane Austen and they automatically assume period romance. So, yes, that is important, but as we've also talked about, so is the social biting satire, and of course in Regency Cthulhu, solving mythos mysteries and running away screaming from things. But yes, romance is important. It's a fundamental part of the game, or it can be if you want it to be.
Romance is a little bit difficult to do in a tabletop role-playing game setting because, of course, it's a different dynamic than usual storytelling. You're involving somebody else in the romance. Can you talk about some of the ways that including romance from a game perspective is different?
It's a little bit more challenging because you've really got to make sure that everybody is on board with it. We've all heard horror stories. I've seen examples of it in the past of people being creepy about it. You know, they're trying to use what their characters are up to get off with somebody else at the gaming table or to have some weird, odd parasocial relationship with somebody who isn't interested. So you've got to treat it carefully. You've got to treat it with respect. But if you're playing it with someone that you trust, it can add a really interesting additional fun dimension to a game. So consent is something that we do address in the book. Andy Peregrine wrote a lovely little box there for it. And it makes one very important point is the fact that to remember that while you may think you're as charming as Mr. Darcy, you may in fact be coming off as creepy as Mr. Collins. So those who know Pride and Prejudice know exactly what I'm talking about there. So before you even start with romance in a game, you have to make sure that people are on board.
So, how far is the perfect amount for Regency Cthulhu? Because you could go all the way to having characters, that fall in love, to sort of just a fun afterthought. Is there a sort of intended level for Regency Cthulhu?
That is entirely up to your group. How much you want to go into it, how far it goes, entirely up to the group and the players. You said before you start, you have to make sure that the players are on board. You have to get their consent, and it has to be an enthusiastic consent. So yes, we want to do romance. If you're not getting an enthusiastic consent, don't do it. Either because you're uncomfortable, because you're playing with a group of people that you don't know very well, so you're not quite sure where to go with things, or just because it's not something that you and your group are interested in. So it's going to vary on a group by group basis. Some groups are going to go all in and, go for the grand, my family, I have 6 sisters. We all desperately need a husband. The matchmaking is a big part of the game, to the whole chaste, unrequited, sort of like pining after the handsome gentleman at the ball kind of thing. And, as long as it is entered into enthusiastically by everyone concerned, that's great. And you can have a huge amount of fun with it. But don't force it if people aren't interested.
So, if you are somebody who hasn't included romance in their games before, and then you enter something like Regency Cthulhu or another game where romance can be a feature, but you have no idea where to start, what would your advice be?
Well, for a start, watch some Jane Austen adaptations. See how relationships are usually portrayed in those. Um, I would say read the books, but quite often just watching a couple of episodes of a BBC costume drama is a lot faster. You're not going to get all the nuance of the stories, but it's going to give you an idea of how things are played out, how things are set up, how people talk to each other. It's very, very formal. It really is. And the book Regency Cthulhu discusses how relationships and meeting other people was very tightly controlled and regulated. Again, how much of that you stick with is up to your group. You may decide to have slightly less restrictions, but it is all terribly prescriptive and formalized. But that can actually also be quite useful if it's something that you've not done before, because there's that framework that allows you to explain it. One of the other things that I'm going to nick from LARP is constant check-in. So even if somebody's consented to a romance, always remember that that consent can be removed at any time, and have a quick visual check. So one of the ones that they use in LARP is that it's completely non-verbal. So just, as a romance is building, just okay. Are you okay to the player? And if they give you a thumbs up, that's a go. If they're not happy with the way things are going, thumbs down. If they're not sure, but this counts as a no as well. Again, it's back to that enthusiastic consent.
Is there a different approach for if you are involving a romance between player characters, or maybe a romance between a player character and an NPC?
This comes down to always remembering that the GM is a player too. So if the GM's not happy running romance, there's, it counts in the same way as if the players aren't happy having romance. Everyone has to be on board, GM and player alike.
I was going to ask if there's a different set of advice pieces that you could give around trying to balance the spotlight when you're using romance in a scene and you're not trying to show, one character up more than another. But then I realized maybe it's just the same advice that you would normally give to try and balance a scene. Do all of the sort of standard pieces of TTRPG advice, how to be a good keeper, how to be a good game master, apply? Or is there anything that is keenly different?
I'd say that the usual advice applies. Obviously, you are putting a particular player or players in the spotlight to develop this romance. So just make sure that you're not excluding the other players and that their investigators have things that they can go do too. Switch between so that you aren't focusing, for prolonged periods on the romancing characters. But it can provide nice little extra levels of intrigue and difficulty that really add spice to the game. But yes, it's just like any other form of spotlighting that happens.
When we talk about romance stories, we have a very clear idea of what that means. But most stories, most films, books we read probably have some element of romance in them. Because I don't think that's necessarily the case with TTRPGs. If romance tends to come in, it tends to be quite a important point. Do you think we should be more casual about the role of romance in TTRPGs, or is this something that always has to be treated a little bit differently just because of the nature of the consent needed?
I think it's probably always going to need to be treated a little bit more differently, at least until we all get really used to just automatically dealing with safety tools and consent as part of our games. Those of us who are a bit older have got a little bit more learning to do and just getting used to it, whereas younger players, it's part and parcel of most games now. So it's something that is there from the word off. Obviously, I've been playing games and this is reasonably recent. I mean, there are some very good romance games out there. You've got Emily Caboss's romance trilogy. You've got Alex Ross's Star-Crossed. There's the Fog of Love board game as well. So, there are games out there that focus specifically on romance. But I do think that if people are willing and are happy to go for it, it can add a huge extra dimension to games. But it is something that people aren't necessarily used to doing. So, baby steps. Take it slow, take it steady. And if you do trust the people that you're gaming with, it's great fun. But never ever put yourself in a situation for anything in a game that you're not happy or comfortable with.
I completely agree with you about everything that you said about consent checklists and about what we need to be doing to make sure that everybody in a romance game is comfortable with it. But with that said, I want to ask about some stylistic elements, literally just gameplay advice, stuff that is relevant to people who it is assumed are proceeding correctly and who have got all that kind of background work done. Do you have any advice for how to deal with breakups or unrequited love or the kind of things that come when a romance doesn't necessarily go well? How do you run that effectively?
Well, I mean, that's again, this is just all extra role-playing grist to the mill, isn't it? Oh, so you can have certain investigators who won't speak to each other, or who sort of like actively avoid them. You can have all sorts of interesting misunderstandings. Um, so it's the same way that you would handle any other sort of intra-party conflict. Things we got corrected for saying inter-party last time, and I really should know better, being a former geneticist. Um, so yeah, just make sure it doesn't spiral out of all control, so it's derailing your story. But in terms of character development and sort of like witty asides and witty snipes, which let's face it, is a lot of what Austen is about. Um, it's great. It's great fun.
Are there assumed relationships between any of the pre-generated characters in Regency Cthulhu?
No, there's not. There's the option for them. Obviously, we have the eligible Captain Stone in there, who is a war hero and therefore and slightly mysterious because not many people know anything about him. So yes, of course, he's there as the sort of like, oh, the dashing military captain. That certainly when we were playtesting it, one or two of the young ladies did sort of set their cap at him, and he died at the end of the first scenario, redeeming his honor, having seriously slighted a young lady's reputation at one point, the bounder. Um, so another one of the players, actually, because that character was then obviously dead and couldn't disagree with any of this. Sort of because she basically was a very smart woman who didn't want to have to get married. She lied to the local vicar and told him that they'd had extramarital relations and she was pregnant shortly before he'd been killed, and convinced the vicar to retroactively marry them so that her honor would not be impugned. It had all been a secret marriage ceremony and everything, because it was complete fabrication. There'd been no relationship between the two at all. But now she was a widow and didn't have to get married, so she was quite happy. She could live her life the way she wanted.
That's a spectacular story. And it leads on to something kind of interesting. We talked in the previous interview we did with Andrew as well, that the bigotry that is inherent in the Regency era is something that really comes out in Regency Cthulhu. It's something that is structured around the way that people interact with each other. Obviously, play any kind of game you want, and if you want to stay away from any elements, please do. But do you have any advice for people who might be wanting to introduce the kinds of love that maybe weren't recognized during the Regency era, people who want to play LGBTI plus investigators or things like that?
As we discuss in the rulebook, it's not that those relationships didn't happen. In some respects, getting together with your significant other, if they were of the same gender as you, was actually easier because, two men meeting up together was not seen as particularly strange. Two women meeting up together on their own was not seen as particularly strange or requiring a chaperone. So the certain elements of it are actually easier to manage. Keeping the actual romantic element hidden is a particular thing, because it's another one of these ones where, depending on the level of society you're at, depends on how much you can get away with it, how much it will be accepted, or how much of a blind eye is turned to it. So again, that's just something, as long as you handle it sensitively, why not?
The processes of courtship change over the years, and I'd love to know, can you give, just for flavor purposes, any indications of what strange things might have been considered a normal part of courtship during the Regency era, the time of the Regency Cthulhu?
Well, we've got all this terribly staged sort of like formal meetings and things. The fact that you're not left alone with your suitor unless they're actually asking for your hand in marriage. And of course, this all has to have been sanctioned by your parents first. That's, the going to your father to ask for permission to marry you is a big thing, which isn't so much nowadays. But I know my husband went and asked my dad for permission, like, just because it was kind of expected and it was the tradition, not that I'm a chattel good to be handed off to anybody. So, you've got that kind of thing going on. You've got the whole, families massively interfering. in who you can and can't marry because of different social class. That's a key factor in the Persuasion novel. The fact that the suitor is not deemed to be of the correct social class, even though he's a good man. Um, you've got various oh, I'm trying to think now. Mine's just gone a blank. So, you've got all this formality around it. One of the most interesting things that people don't realize and is actually misrepresented in the bit of Bridgerton that I did watch is the fact that just because a marriage proposal is made to a woman, she is under no obligation to accept it. It's a major decision. So there was absolutely no stigma attached to a woman saying no, because she had to look at this and go, this is the guy who is effectively going to own me, own everything I possess. Am I happy with this happening? Because unless he dies, I have no way out of this, no honorable, reputable way out of this. Whereas for guys, it was very much a case of if you make an offer of marriage and it is accepted by the woman, for you to back out on that is a real slight to your honor. There will be serious social consequences, repercussions if you do that. And again, that is quite often played up in a lot of the Austen novels. So Sense and Sensibility and various things like that. Edward Ferrars, he's made a rash offer of marriage to a young woman who's accepted. Nobody else knows about it, but because he's an honourable gentleman, he cannot remove that offer, even though he's fallen in love with Eleanor. It has to stand until circumstances change. So you've got all these weird intricacies that mean that, it's, making a marriage offer in haste as a gentleman is a terrible, terrible and silly thing to do.
You've given us some insight into all of the strange ways that people have to relate to each other if they're not married and they can't be left alone, and et cetera, et cetera. If you are playing a long-running game of Regency Cthulhu and you get married to another PC, what advantages is that going to give you? Is it suddenly fine for you to be spending a lot of time together, even in social circumstances? Or is there still some kind of barrier that means you're going to have to adhere to a different kind of rigid rule?
Well, technically, married women were supposed to stay home and produce babies, but then women were supposed to stay home anyway. So, we're not having any of that. But no, if you're married to your husband, spending time with him is perfectly acceptable.
Fantastic. Is there anything that I've forgotten here, Lynne? I've kind of exhausted the bulk of my
I think
list.
so. I mean, the other great thing about being married is that you get to be chaperones for your unmarried friends. So you can actively encourage them into naughtiness because you are providing the thin veneer of respectability by your presence. So yeah, being a married character can actually be quite entertaining.
Well, let's finish off then with a little bit of a trick question. If I'm a kind of player who really is not interested in romance, has never looked at it before in a game, and I'm thinking that's not something I'm going to include, that's not for me, how would you sell it to me? How would you say, actually, this is going to be something really cool for you? Why don't you have a think about it?
Role playing is all about doing something a bit different. Doing something that isn't something that you would normally do in a game. So, as long as you feel confident in the group of people that you're with, why not give it a try? It may turn out that it isn't what you're interested in, but it may also turn out that you have a wonderful time developing this extra aspect of your character that you've never really thought about before. It might allow you to play up all sorts of intrigues that you'd never thought about before. So I completely understand why people might be a little bit unsure, but it never hurts to try something new. Just remember that at any point in time, you can just draw a veil over it and go, no, not for me, and the game can continue along its own little merry path.